This story begins in the early hours of November 9th, 2019, in St. Petersburg. At around 4 a.m., emergency dispatchers received a frantic call. A taxi driver passing by the embankment reported a man drowning in the freezing waters of the Moika River, desperately screaming for help. When first responders arrived, they managed to pull the elderly man onto the stone embankment. He was suffering from severe hypothermia and, as it turned out, was heavily intoxicated. In the shivering, drenched figure, the officers didn't immediately recognize 63-year-old Oleg Sokolov, a prominent state university professor, a world-renowned historian, and a recipient of France's highest national order. At first glance, it looked like a standard tragic accident. But right from the start, one bizarre detail raised serious red flags for the police. Even in the freezing water, while actively risking going under, the professor had a death grip on his heavy backpack and absolutely refused to let it go. Officers opened the bag, hoping to find the victim's ID. Instead of documents, they found a non-lethal handgun and a gruesome discovery that would shatter the esteemed academic's reputation in a matter of seconds. Inside the backpack were fragments of a human body. While paramedics worked to stabilize the professor, a team of detectives was already rushing to his high-end apartment in the city's historic center. Stepping into the luxurious residence, furnished with expensive antiques, investigators were met with an even more horrifying scene. Inside, they found the murder weapon and the concealed remains of a 24-year-old graduate student, Anastasia Yeshchenko. How did one of the country's most respected and brilliant minds end up in a freezing river in the dead of night, carrying the remains of his young student? Was it a tragic accident, fueled by a sudden crime of passion, as the defense would later claim? Or, behind the facade of an elite, respectable life, had a cruel and calculating predator been hiding for years? To answer that question, and to truly understand what led to the events of that fateful night, we have to go back a few years. To understand the sheer scale of the shock that gripped the nation following the news from the Moika River, you have to realize exactly who Oleg Sokolov was. In academic circles, he was considered an absolute authority. A brilliant lecturer, the author of dozens of monographs, and one of the founding fathers of the historical reenactment movement in Russia. His main area of expertise was the era of Napoleon Bonaparte. Sokolov didn't just study history, he literally lived it. During his lectures, he would often raise his voice, switch into flawless French, and put on full-blown theatrical performances, consistently drawing packed halls of mesmerized students. And it was in one of those very lecture halls that young Anastasia Yeshchenko found herself. She had moved to St. Petersburg from the southern Krasnodar region. The young woman grew up in a well-respected family. Her mother was a police lieutenant colonel, and her father was a school teacher. Anastasia graduated high school with top honors and enrolled in the history department of the city's premier university. Acquaintances described her as a modest, incredibly intelligent, and highly driven girl who spent all her free time buried in archives and libraries. A shared, almost obsessive passion for French history quickly brought the esteemed professor and the young student together. The 39-year age gap wasn't an obstacle for them. At first, their relationship was strictly academic. They co-authored research papers. But soon, this connection evolved into something much more. To the outside world, their union looked like an unusual, yet beautiful 19th century fairy tale. Anastasia moved into Sokolov's spacious apartment on the Moika embankment. The couple regularly traveled to Europe and took part in massive historical reenactments. In photos from that time, Sokolov proudly poses in the gold-embroidered uniform of a French general, with Anastasia by his side in elegant Empire-era ball gowns. Within their inner circle, it was customary to observe strict historical etiquette. The professor demanded to be addressed as sire, and he referred to Anastasia as Isabel. From the outside, it seemed like the perfect symbiosis between a brilliant mentor and his devoted muse. The girl looked at him with genuine adoration, while he opened the doors to elite academic circles for her. However, behind the heavy doors of their apartment, far from the admiring glances of colleagues and the flashes of cameras, this romantic historical fairy tale was unfolding according to a completely different script. The flawless facade was hiding total subjugation, a control that very soon began to take on terrifying forms. To understand how a 24-year-old woman found herself in a deadly trap, we have to look at the psychology of Oleg Sokolov. Gradually, the 19th century fairy tale began to warp into a gilded cage. The professor's colleagues would later admit, Sokolov wasn't just studying Napoleon. At some point, he genuinely began to believe he was the emperor's modern-day reincarnation. This megalomania demanded constant feeding, and Anastasia became the perfect target. Methodically and calculatingly, the professor began to isolate the young woman from her natural support system. The mere thought of Anastasia having a life outside his influence was unbearable to him. College parties, hanging out with peers, simple get-togethers with friends, all of it was strictly, though unofficially, forbidden. Every time Anastasia tried to spend time with someone her own age, it triggered bouts of uncontrollable, pathological jealousy in the professor. He drilled it into her head that her peers were foolish, empty people, entirely unworthy of her intellect. Step by step, he built an impenetrable wall around her, leaving Anastasia with only one center of the universe, himself. Witnesses to their relationship recalled that at public events, Sokolov could suddenly snap and start screaming if he felt Anastasia had looked the wrong way or hadn't shown him the proper reverence. The young woman, crushed under the immense psychological pressure and the authority of her professor, would usually just fall silent and obediently lower her eyes. It is the textbook pattern of an abuser. Cut the victim off from family and friends so they have no one to turn to for help. Anastasia's brother would later tell investigators that in the final months of her life, she often called him in tears. She complained about Sokolov's total control and sudden outbursts of aggression. She knew she was in a toxic relationship, and even tried to leave the professor several times. But every single time, he found a way to pull her back in. He threatened, he manipulated, he swore eternal love, and he weaponized his status at the university to hold her future academic career hostage. Many in the couple's circle saw these glaring red flags, but in that academic environment, no one wanted to cross such a powerful and respected figure. Everyone preferred to turn a blind eye to his harsh temper, brushing it off as the eccentricity of a genius. No one even suspected that this exact scenario had played out before, and that buried in Professor Sokolov's past was a dark, violent secret, one that could have saved Anastasia's life if only the authorities had done their job in time. What ultimately happened to Anastasia Yeshchenko was not a sudden break from reality or a tragic accident. The dark side had been lurking behind the mask of the gallant professor for a very long time. And the most terrifying part of this story is that this tragedy could have been prevented. 11 years before these events, in 2008, there was another young student in Oleg Sokolov's life, and the trajectory of their relationship followed a terrifyingly similar script. First came the grand courtship, the poetry, and the historical balls. Then, the total control, the isolation, and the outbursts of uncontrollable aggression. When the young woman realized she was entangled with a cruel tyrant, she tried to leave. But the professor's reaction was unprecedented. Under the guise of a calm, peaceful conversation, he lured her to that very same elite apartment on the Moika embankment. The moment the massive door closed behind her, the academic instantly revealed his true colors. Later, in her official police statement, the victim would describe the chilling details. The professor tied the girl to a chair and subjected her to severe psychological and physical torture. Using a scorching hot household appliance, he coldly threatened to inflict irreversible, lifelong physical damage. Sokolov explicitly promised that he would dispose of her permanently and cover up all the evidence if she ever dared to leave. Miraculously, the young woman managed to break free and escape. She immediately went to the authorities, had her injuries officially documented, and filed a detailed police report. You would think that after such an incident, the academic's career and freedom would be over forever. But what happened next is absolutely shocking. Her statement simply vanished into the bureaucratic machine. The professor's status, his title as a Knight of a French Order, and his connections in the highest academic echelons did their job. The university elite preferred to sweep the scandal under the rug to protect the institution's reputation. The investigation was quietly closed. The historian remained completely unpunished. He continued to give lectures, publish books, and charm new freshmen. The realization of his own untouchability completely erased any boundaries of what was permitted. The professor's megalomania morphed into a conviction that he had the right to play God with other people's lives. If the justice system had worked in 2008, Anastasia Yeshchenko would still be alive. But the system turned a blind eye to his cruelty, and this willful indifference led to the fatal consequences in November of 2019. The tension that had been building inside the gilded cage for months reached a breaking point on November 7, 2019. That fateful evening, Anastasia had perfectly normal plans. The young woman was getting ready to attend a birthday party for a friend her own age. But for the professor, accustomed to absolute and undivided control over his muse, her mere desire to spend time outside his influence became the ultimate trigger. A vicious argument erupted within the walls of the elite Moika embankment apartment. Neighbors would later confirm to investigators that they heard loud screaming and crying coming through the walls. But, as is so often the case in cold, indifferent metropolises, no one paid it any mind, choosing not to interfere in someone else's domestic dispute. Realizing the sheer insanity of the situation, Anastasia made a desperate decision. In tears, she ran out of the apartment and into the stairwell. But then, she made a fatal mistake. After a short while, the young woman went back inside to gather her belongings. The moment that heavy front door clicked shut once more, the trap was permanently sealed. The verbal altercation escalated into a physical confrontation. In a state of absolute blinding rage, the academic picked up an illegally modified weapon he kept in the home. Muffled gunshots echoed through the luxurious, antique-filled apartment. The life of a young, talented woman with a brilliant future ahead of her was tragically cut short right there, surrounded by history books and 19th-century theatrical costumes. In that very second, the great scholar Oleg Sokolov ceased to exist. All that remained in his place was a man who had crossed the point of no return. You would think that, in a moment like this, any normal person would fall into a panic or immediately call emergency services. But the most terrifying part of this story isn't the tragedy itself. The most horrifying part is the unbelievable, inhuman cynicism the professor would display the very next day. Morning broke on November 8th. A sinister, heavy silence hung over the apartment on the Moika embankment. Instead of grasping the sheer horror of what he had done, falling into a panic, or turning himself into the authorities, Oleg Sokolov displayed a terrifying cold-bloodedness. The man who, just yesterday, had delivered grandiose lectures on honor and nobility, began to act with the calculating precision of a cold-blooded psychopath. But the most bizarre and mind-boggling event occurred later that same evening. The professor hosted guests. They were longtime friends and colleagues from the academic world. Playing the gracious host, Sokolov set the table in his luxurious living room. They drank expensive cognac, animatedly discussed French history, debated military campaigns, and made plans for future historical reenactments. All while just a few feet away, behind the tightly closed door of the next room, lay the irreversible consequences of the previous night's tragedy. The professor smiled effortlessly, proposed elegant toasts, and made casual small talk. Not a single muscle twitched on his face. Not a tremor in his voice betrayed the nightmare hidden literally right through the wall. His guests drank their wine, completely oblivious to the fact that they were sitting in the middle of a gruesome crime scene. This level of psychological control and hypocrisy baffles even seasoned criminologists. Sokolov was reveling in his power over the situation, drunk on his own perceived superiority. In his twisted reality, he was a great military commander who was permitted to do anything, and who stood far above any mortal court of law. But the dinner party eventually came to an end. The guests warmly bid farewell to their hospitable host and left the apartment. The heavy front door clicked shut. Oleg Sokolov was once again entirely alone, face to face with his horrifying secret. Now he had to solve his most difficult problem: how to erase Anastasia Yeshchenko from this world without a trace. And to do that, the great scholar took a trip to an ordinary hardware store. The moment the illusion of normalcy vanished with the departure of his guests, the academic moved to the final phase of his plan. The great military commander he had so diligently imagined himself to be for years vanished without a trace. In his place remained only a terrified, frantic old man, desperately trying to save his own reputation and freedom. On the afternoon of November 9th, Sokolov went to a nearby hardware store. Security cameras impassively recorded his route. The professor's purchases were terrifyingly pragmatic: heavy-duty black trash bags and specialized hardware tools. Returning to his elite apartment, he deadbolted the door and began the darkest chapter of this crime. Investigators would later determine that to drown out the last remnants of his humanity and cope with the creeping primal fear, Sokolov began drinking hard liquor continuously. The alcohol numbed his mind, allowing him to methodically, hour after hour, perform the mechanical work of concealing the primary evidence. What exactly happened behind those closed doors during those hours will forever remain locked within the pages of the criminal case file. His plan to dispose of the tragedy's aftermath was sickeningly simple. Sokolov's apartment was located directly on the Moika embankment. The river, with its dark, freezing waters, flowed literally steps away from his front door. He didn't need to rent a car or drive the evidence out to a deserted forest. All he had to do was wait for the dead of night, when the city was completely asleep. Packing the first set of evidence into a heavy backpack, the professor put on a warm coat and stepped over the threshold of his apartment. He made his way down the stairs and stepped out into the cold, windswept night. The dark water was only a few dozen yards away. The perfect crime was almost complete. Sokolov was certain the river would hide his secret forever. But he failed to account for one single, fatal detail. A detail that would completely destroy his plan. The dead of night. The streets of St. Petersburg are completely deserted. Oleg Sokolov slowly approaches the granite parapet of the Moika River embankment. In his hands is the heavy backpack, securely hiding the primary evidence inside. The professor's plan was brutally simple and calculated to the smallest detail. Dump the payload into the dark water, make sure it sinks to the bottom, and calmly return to his warm, elite apartment to continue scrubbing the crime scene. But the alcohol, downed for liquid courage and to suppress his panic, played a cruel trick on the academic. His coordination was severely impaired. Attempting to heave the unexpectedly heavy backpack over the high railing, Sokolov lost his balance. His feet slipped on the cold, damp stone of the embankment, and in the next second, the prominent historian crashed into the freezing black water with a loud splash. He found himself in a deadly trap. The backpack he had so desperately tried to get rid of was now dragging him to the bottom. The cold instantly paralyzed his body. Panic flooded his mind, and a primal instinct for self-preservation forced the professor to scream for help. And it was those exact screams, piercing the silence of the night, that were heard by the passing taxi driver we mentioned at the very beginning of our story. The irony of fate was ruthless. Had Oleg Sokolov not stumbled that night, the disappearance of Anastasia Yeshchenko might have forever remained just another unsolved perfect crime. The young woman would have been declared a missing person, and the esteemed professor would have continued giving lectures and charming new students. But the man who considered himself a grand strategist and a modern-day Napoleon was brought down by his own pathetic clumsiness. By the very next morning, the news of the academic luminary's arrest would detonate across the nation's headlines. But the way this genius would behave during interrogations and in the courtroom would evoke even more disgust from the public than the crime itself. When the trial began, the entire nation expected to see genuine remorse. But the former academic's behavior in the courtroom shocked the public to its core. The man who had spent his life playing the role of a noble officer morphed into a hysterical, self-pitying old man right in front of the television cameras. Sokolov sobbed loudly in the defendant's cage, threw theatrical tantrums, and tried with all his might to smear Anastasia's name. He claimed it was a crime of passion, that the young woman had allegedly driven him to a breakdown, and that he was simply the victim of tragic circumstances. He wasn't fighting for forgiveness. He was desperately fighting for the shattered remains of his own ego. But the court didn't buy the fairy tale of a sudden psychotic break. The purchase of the tools, the cold-blooded dinner party with guests, and the late-night trip to the river proved the exact opposite. This was a conscious, brutal, and calculated act. In December of 2020, Oleg Sokolov was found guilty and sentenced to 12.5 years in a maximum security penal colony. The great historian permanently traded his gold-embroidered uniform for a prison jumpsuit. This story leaves a heavy, bitter aftertaste. We are used to thinking that real threats lurk in dark alleyways or deserted parks. But the Sokolov case proved something far more terrifying. Sometimes, monsters wear expensive suits. They give lectures at elite universities, receive national awards, and smile at us from our television screens. And society, blinded by their authority and connections, turns a blind eye to their cruelty for years until it is far too late. Why do you think the academic elite ignored the glaring red flags and protected the professor for so many years? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one of them. If you want to support the channel and join me on more walks through these dark, true crime investigations, please hit that like button and subscribe. It means the world to me.